Which we are. All right. So, and others will join us, I hope. But welcome back. I hope you had a great week off. By the way, you've been sending in a lot of things for me to grade, so I really appreciate that. But keep them coming. If I'm looking at it correctly, probably now you should be, if you have not already, working on your SIAP 3, Part 3, Part 4 is probably the big things you need to accomplish over the next couple of weeks. Now, I know most of you are coming up on a spring break, I hope, and this is a great time to knock out these things and get them all in here as quickly as possible. Tonight is Zoom week 9, so we are well over halfway there. So tonight, and by the way, you may notice I have allergies or some kind of chest cold or something, so forgive me if I sound a little groggy, but I do want to go over a couple of things with you tonight. And first of all, we'll go to, I've got some really interesting things I've added to our class session, Zoom session tonight. For those of you who are in South Carolina, some interesting data about South Carolina. And the reason I included this is because I know that all of you are at some point going to want to enroll into a doctoral program. Maybe after a couple of years when you complete the master's, I understand that. But at some point, you're going to need to have access, when you start working on that, to a lot of information about your state. And when you start doing that research, so whenever I find something that I really think may be helpful for you down the road, I think it's awesome. Well, here's some information about South Carolina. And it breaks it down by I think they have 81 counties or 85, 89 counties, I believe. I saw that someplace. But you can kind of look at it and kind of discover from your own county. And I think at the end of this one, it has a link where you can go and look at specific information about your county. But you can see like poverty. You can see like per capita income. And all of this may be good for you as you begin to do some research on your own employment data. So anyway, that's for South Carolina. So I would encourage you to use that. In North Carolina, and South Carolina has something like this, but it's a little bit more difficult to pull it together and to find it. But in North Carolina, we have something called the Consolidated Data Reports. And the reason I call your attention to this is because those of us in North Carolina, this is a huge report that comes out every March. And as it is presenting to our State Board of Education, the Consolidated Report, which I'll bring up one, talks about, North Carolina has two big things, and one is the grade dump, where we do our testing piece, and that usually comes in the fall, and in the spring we do our information piece about other parts of the school environment. This comes out every year. Hey, Julia. This comes out every year and is a wonderful resource as you begin to, again, start looking at putting together pieces of information for your, hey, DJ, for your final project. So if you are in North Carolina and you're called upon at some point to put together some information, this is the most absolute current information. And it covers such things in North Carolina as school crime and violence, suspensions and expulsion, and I'm going to go show you shortly, capital corporal punishment. We still do that in North Carolina in 1 or 2 districts, but I think it's illegal now, so we won't be able to do it at all. Shouldn't be able to do it all. Student reassignments, and then the big thing that people want to look at, of course, is the dropout counts and rates. So let me very quickly take you down to show you kind of an interesting piece. All right. And this part is the high school dropout rates by county. And you can look at a county like Wake County. Well, let's look. Charlotte Meck might be a better one since somebody here may be from Charlotte Meck. Where is good old Charlotte Meck? I bet it's Mecklenburg. But anyway, it breaks Let's don't look at Charlotte Meck. Let's look at Chapel Hill Carrboro. But it breaks it down, and this
Charlotte Meck was number 600 on there.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Oh, here it is. You're right. All right. Here's great old Charlotte Meck, the greater state of Charlotte Meck. Hey, Mark. So you can break it down, and it covers all these different kinds of information about the school district. So, and even within this report, you can break it down and break out the high schools within Charlotte Meck. But you can see in Charlotte Mecklenburg, they had 1,035 dropouts last year. And these are people who or should have graduated from high school. And you can break it down, male, female, black, white, Hispanic, multiracial, and it kind of gives you some really wonderful information. And then when you're looking at the number of people, if you study the number of people getting adult high school diplomas, you've got that there. So it's a great resource to use if you need something that's really up to date. And like I was saying when we came on board, South Carolina has something like this as well. It's just it's not put together in one comprehensive report. And so next week I'll try to maneuver through South Carolina's website, the Department of Public Instruction, and try to find a way in which we can pull all that together. But some wonderful information, and again, it breaks it down for you about, it also does charter schools, and it breaks down, before it even starts, it talks a little bit about some of the trends and some of the demographics that they see. So if you're doing your dissertation, or if you decide when you get into your doctoral program that you want to write about the dropout rate in North Carolina, or something about it, or some kind of efforts about dropout rate, this is a phenomenal resource to be able to go back and pull information directly from the Department of Public Instruction. So I want to just call your attention to that. So let me show you, for those of you who joined a little bit later, all of this is under Class Session 9. South Carolina data here. For those of you in South Carolina, and you start writing research and start looking for specific information, it's all right here under some information you can pull. South Carolina data. North Carolina Consolidated Report. Excellent. That's what I just walked through. A couple of other things. This particular tonight, we're going to be talking about discipline and the role of discipline in the school administrator's life. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. So there are a couple of other things here that are a little bit more dated from Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system. And there's a huge PowerPoint here. I'm not going to use it, but you certainly are feel free to use it. And a couple of articles about teacher evaluations and being a future-ready teacher. All right, so before I go into talking about discipline tonight, which is our main topic, I do want to kind of, Dr. Robertson's going to join us next week to talk about your SIOPs. But when I went online today and looked at the grading to see what you all have done, you guys are really moving quite along. I think about 47% when I did the math of everything that you need to complete this course has been done. And everyone except for one student one of our colleagues has started on your SIAPs, and most of you are already down to number 2. Here's some of the commonalities that I'm seeing, and Mark will talk about this a little bit more next week. When you start turning in something, and when you do SIA3, make sure, when you start turning in that, because I think that's where most of you are right now, remember that we're looking for that focus group. And the one thing that I'm seeing that I usually will send back and ask you to kind of consider adding another thing too, is to add an external member to that team. It's so easy for us to have a team of 6 people we've identified, and all of them being school staff, but at least put one external person. Now, and you may already have an external person on there, but if it's not pretty clear to me when I'm reading it that this is an external person, that's probably why I would send it back. So make sure it's you know, you spell it out: Steve Stone, parent, PTA parent, or you know, watchdog dad, or something that would clearly identify me as not a school person. Because if there's an acronym that I may not know that your school uses, I'll probably grade you down that you didn't have an external person. And remember that what you're doing with that is you really are trying, it's really just a snapshot of your conversations with those 10 people that you get together. It's a snapshot of what you've already discussed about your student data, attendance, accomplishments, and your teacher working conditions survey. So out of that, what we really are looking for is, what kind of conversations did y'all have in this team? Were there any suggestions moving forward? Were there any kinds of things that you wanted to do next? So really, number 3 is a concentration of 1 and 2, that discussion that's held about 1 and 2 and what to do next moving forward. Now, when you get to discussion or to task number 4, this one is another one that I'm sending back a couple of times, is because I really am looking for an understanding that it costs money and time when you're wanting to do something different in your school building. When you say that you're going to create a mentor program, I really am looking for an understanding that, you know, that means that you're going to have to move a staff or pay a staff member in the afternoon if they're going to be doing that. Or it could be as simple as you're going to free up someone to do it, but that needs to be spelled out. That's a resource. And if it's, and again, a chart is awesome. And that chart in its resources should not just address people, but should address the resources that you need, financial resources and any other kinds of resources. And a chart is great, and within that conversation. And the narrative around all of that is clearly showing an understanding that that you know where the sources for some of those resources. That means if you know your Title I is going to be used and you're going to use some of your Title I money for this, then it's an understanding that you know what Title I money is and how much your school gets for Title I. Okay? Task 5 is the graphic organizer, and that's kind of like putting it all together. You are so familiar with these kinds of graphic organizers. It's who's going to do it, who's responsible, the timeline, any kind of price or resource that's attached to it, who's responsible, and what will you know when it's a success. So that's just a huge kind of graphic organizer that's showing that. But the key here is that it's got to show relationships. So within that graphic organizer, the relationship piece needs to be Steve Stone's going to do this, he's going to, and how it's going to relate to the entire goal. So how one thing builds upon the other. And then for number 6 is the reflections, basically of all those 21 competencies that you are required to master. This is a reflection of them. And this is where you should go in and pull out your internship logs and say, this is 3 evidences of how I did this. So there we're just looking for a narrative. But I am looking for all 21 of them, and I do count all 21. And so in that, try to also, and I do look for 3 for each one of them. And then once you get that done, of course, that whole document comes back to me before you do turn it in. Turn it in is the final step, but before you do turn it in, send it back to me under final and mark Dr. Robertson, and we'll look at it. So when it does go to task stream, that it'll be that perfect 100. Also, and we'll talk about this in week 15, the very last week we meet together, but there is a place for you to do some personal reflections, but that's on the Blackboard side. All right. So any questions about where you should be or the timing of everything right now before I spend a little time talking about constructive discipline as long as I can talk? Anybody have any questions? All right. Well, let's go look at this. Oh, well, let me unlock it so you can look at it at home. And I'm sorry I'm coughing and stuff like that. I think it's sinuses. All right, so our broad topic tonight is, of course, discipline. So I want to spend a little time about what we want to consider constructive discipline, because there may be a different understanding of discipline and constructive discipline. So I'm going to talk to you basically a little bit. I'm going to move you again about constructive discipline. All right, and I'm going to talk. You can read. I understand that. And I'm not going to read it to you. Discipline and punishment are, of course, 2 different things. Discipline is within itself. It's cyclical. It's the whole purpose of discipline versus punishment is that discipline is a learning experience. And this is nothing new that you as classroom teachers or others don't know. But when you are disciplining a child, and we're going to talk a little bit about children, but really the message from here is discipline of employees, because you are in a principal or assistant principal, you are going to be called upon many times in your career between now and the time you retire, that you're going to have that really uncomfortable conversation with one of your employees. And when you are the assistant principal, you can kind of say, well, it's always easy to say, well, I'll try, but then the principal can do it. But when you become, which is not a good philosophy, by the way, but when you become the principal, the buck really does stop with you. As a superintendent, I never wanted to discipline a teacher in your building. That's not my job. That's your job, and that's what I pay you as a principal to do. That's also what I pay you as an assistant principal to do, is to maintain that building, which means correct people when they're wrong. But so discipline in broad, discipline is a circle in that it's not completed until the relationship has been restored. Because when you discipline that new teacher or that teacher who's been there for a while for coming in late 3 times this week, you are going to in some way damage the relationship that you have built with that person. And it's going to be very difficult for you when you move into an assistant principalship I would certainly not recommend, if any way you could help it, unless you had no other option, not to be the assistant principal in the school you're serving in now, or the school that you're serving in as a teacher. It's going to be extremely awkward, because as a teacher, other teachers can go to you and feel as if you are a peer. Whereas when you become an administrator, an assistant principal, and there are exceptions to this, but this is the broad general rule. When you become that assistant principal, they will test you more than they're going to test the principal. They're going to push you more than they would push the principal, because they've had a different kind of relationship with you. They have that good relationship with you as a teacher, or it may not even be may not be good, but they have that relationship. So as an AP, I would certainly recommend that you don't go to your school that you are currently teaching in, and become the administrator for them. Has anybody had any experience with that, where someone went on to become, who was a teacher in your building, went on to become an AP? How did that, anybody have an experience you want to share?
Yeah, we at my school, there was our fourth grade teacher went from that to the assistant principal, and he's been the assistant principal now at our school for 3 years.
How is, Kelsey, is it a little awkward?
Not a little awkward, because people, I mean, there were pros and cons. Like, a lot of people and parents and kids already knew him, so there was a lot of relationships already built, so that paid off in a sense, in an elementary mindset when dealing with parents and kids. I think it was a little tough for people that had been on his team, that also taught fourth grade, in certain situations, to approach him differently, because they still felt like they were friends instead of like being a superior type of person to them. And I think some people find it hard to say certain things to them because of relationships built in the building.
Certainly. It would be very interesting to hear what he has to say about how things have changed. But again, if that's your job and that's where you get to go, jump at it if that's your opportunity. But it's not, in my mind, it's not always the best because of those relationships. So anyway, back to discipline. For constructive discipline, there is a positive conclusion. In other words, you have had the discussion, you have disciplined the employee, or you've disciplined the child, that relationship has been restored, and it becomes a positive conclusion, versus punishment, which is a focus on what you did wrong. Discipline is a focus on what you need to work on and how I can help you work on it. Punishment is very clear. You did this, therefore this. Discipline is you did this, therefore what do we need to do to keep it from happening again? Punishment is justice oriented. You're trying to not tip the balance of the scales. Discipline is an opportunity to get to a correct response. Punishment's negative, discipline is positive. That's kind of a different concept to think about, but discipline is positive. And punishment sometimes has been motivated by anger. Discipline is motivated by love. All right, so in your opportunities to discipline or to work with a child, and I hope it's discipline, not punish. Now, I really would like to I want to convey upon you to go ahead and get that word punishment or punish out of your vocabulary. It's a very harsh word. And when you go in to interview and the question may be, what happens when a child does this? The last thing you'd want to say is, I would punish them this way. Okay, so just take punish completely out of our vocabulary, because it's really a very strong, mean word, whereas discipline has different connotations. All right, so in disciplining a child or a teacher, what did you do wrong is obviously your first opportunity question. You give them a chance to respond to it. And again, their response is how you move to the next step, which is to try to get them to some point own the mistake that was made. And the second question was, of course, to get them to understand why it was wrong, how can it be addressed differently, and to provide opportunities through that. And it may very well be that you lead someone, whether it's the teacher or the student, you lead them to different kinds of possible opportunities in the future. And of course, you leave it with the third question is, what are you going to do differently next time? Because the whole discipline, the whole output or desire of discipline is to make sure it's a learning experience. And it is not to kill them. It's not to throw them under the bus, but it really is to say, oops, now what can you do differently? So, and finally, when those conferences, and I know all of you would do this when you become an AP or a principal, that you will end the conference on an affirmative. Now, let's talk about employees. Employees, these are the traditional things that are used with employees in the workplace. And positive reinforcement is a positive discipline. And that's, you all know what that is. It's the carrots, it's the leaving early on Friday afternoon, it's other kinds of things, you know, it's the candy in the mailbox, it's those kinds of things. Those are the positive reinforcements that your administrators give to you on a daily basis. What are some of the others that they do? Anybody have some great examples that can be shared about some things that your administrator does for positive reinforcement?
When we have perfect attendance for a month, our administrators give us a leave early pass that we can leave 30 minutes earlier than what our contract states, as long as we clear it with them first. Sometimes when they observe us, they'll leave us like little notes in our boxes and stuff.
What? Okay.
Trying to think of other things they do.
Let me see if anybody else has got one. Anybody else?
I know at my school we have like with perfect attendance.
Is this for staff or students, DJ?
This is for teachers.
Okay.
And what they do is they give us duty-free lunch where we can go out and leave campus for an hour and come back.
That's nice. Anyone else? Because when you start building your bank, you'd want to have as many ideas as possible, and you may very well want to involve your school improvement team to think about some other options. And I will tell you, DJ brought this up, and I know Kelsey brought it up too. Staff attendance is becoming a real big issue when you start looking at the research of the number of staff members who are absent. And so anything you can do to try to keep that would be great. All right, negative discipline is punishment, is criticism. It's again, it is negative. It is discipline. It is meant to correct behavior. Also, you use goal setting, and you establish with them a process that can be used in the future for when situations come up like this. And of course, keeping that feedback with them. All right. Have any of you ever had to discipline an employee or sit in on that? Anybody had to do that yet? Had an opportunity to sit in on it?
Yes.
Let's tell us. Can you tell us about it without names, Mark?
Yeah, a little bit. So we had a teacher that she had been teaching for quite some time, and we had some problems along the way as far as we would have just, I don't know, just bad decisions, I guess. Like if we had a lockdown drill, she wouldn't pay any attention to it or not listen to the thing, and we'd come by and check, and she'd kind of still be teaching, which is not what we want to do in our lockdown drills. And so there were some red flags that come up. Long story short, we ended up having a issue with some alcohol involved, and ultimately she was put in the position of it was either resign or be dismissed. So It was a pretty serious conversation. I was glad I was just the assistant principal and not any higher up. It involved the superintendent and principal and HR, and probably the worst thing about it is all the talk that went on in the school. And as an administrator, I'm not at liberty to talk about details and names and explain what's going on, because everybody has a certain amount of due process and a certain amount of rights that I can't step over. So a lot of people made a lot of comments that were just unfounded because they didn't know, but yet we couldn't really tell them either.
All right, so let me ask you all, because Mark brings up a great point in that I'm sure you have at some point, your district has been in the newspaper for something, some employee doing something, and when the newspaper calls the HR office or calls the superintendent's office, one of the things they always say is, I can't talk about it because it's a personnel issue. That's because the employee is protected by the federal law, FERPA, the Freedom of Information, FERPA. So, yeah, FERPA. So that's why districts will usually say that. And it's very difficult for districts sometimes because what they are getting is a lot of conversation and wrong stuff. You know, like Mark mentioned, I can only imagine that some of the gossip that went on in that building was horrendously bad and so off. And though Mark may have known the story and may have could have gone through it and said, we can do better than this, and this is kind of the way it really is. Going around to it though, what obligation do you have to tell your staff or to bring your staff up to date when something happens in your school with an employee? Let's just go back to Mark's example. This employee was fired for drinking. Did I remember that correctly, Mark? Drinking?
It did involve alcohol. The teacher was not intoxicated on the property, but there was alcohol in the vehicle.
All right, and there was perhaps insubordination. So
yeah, and there was some other stuff, but that was the straw that broke the camel's back, basically. So
all right, so how would you handle that? Anyone? Next staff meeting, you sent her home today. The staff is just talking about it. Facebook is eat up with it. I mean, everywhere you turn around, there's a lot of conversation about why was Mrs. Smith gone? And people are out there just making all sorts. She touched a student in the bathroom. You know, they're making all sorts of accusations when the answer may be simply, you know, there was alcohol on her breath and we just sent her home. How would you handle that with your staff? Would you just ignore it or would you try to talk to them about it? And if you did, what would you say? Someone help me out. Think about, I mean, this is sort of like a scenario.
I am at a school where we have had issues of this before, of rumors kind of going around, and administration doesn't really address them, and then that becomes just a bigger issue that it ends up having to be addressed. So I think that coming from that experience, I would obviously not tell any details or anything, but just direct staff members to remembering their policies and what they signed up for and those sorts of things and their code of conduct, and making sure we're all on the same page, and just kind of addressing it as obviously there was something that had to be handled and it was dealt with. Don't worry about it, but remind yourself of your integrity and why you're here, and let's move forward, so that it's not ignored, but it can't obviously be just shared in every detail given.
All right. Anyone else? And would you do that, Katie, would you do that in a staff meeting, an emergency staff meeting, or would you kind of do a memo or what? Or would you just kind of one by one when they catch you in the hall, what happened with Miss Smith?
I think I would do it in a staff meeting, just kind of face to face. If anybody has any specific questions that they don't feel like I answered well enough, they can come see me one by one, but just a general face-to-face staff meeting, I feel like is the best way to communicate.
Right. Let me say this to you. I'm glad you didn't say send out an email, because that email is not confidential, and that email is going to go 20 million places before you even know it. Always remember that, folks. When you're talking about personnel, unless you are documenting for yourself or for the district to dismiss the person, don't put it out there in email, because an email is gone the minute you send it, and you cannot get it back. Or I don't know of any way to get it back. People can make copies and things like that. So that's and you will very quickly discover that is done quite a bit. So I think you're right, Julia. Have a very quick little short staff meeting and say, I know you all were talking about why Ms. Smith left. It is a personnel issue. Ms. Smith and I had a conversation, and just know that we're working through some things, and she appreciates your considerations. But we got a job to do, and here's the plan moving forward. Substitute for Mrs. Smith's class. She's going to be working with them. So what we really need to do now is the best way for us to help here is to move on and to do what we're set here to do. Anyone else? Hazard or guess?
Yeah, and I think I can echo what Katie was saying. It's important to remind them of code of ethics and appropriate versus inappropriate behavior. But I do think that after the staff meeting, I don't know that I would leave it open to further questions. I would just say that the decision has been made, and we went through the proper protocol to take care of what we took care of. They no longer work here. We appreciate your concern, thank you very much kind of thing. Because I think if you open it up to come see me to ask personal questions, even if you don't say personal questions, that's going to like open you up to a bunch of people in your office trying to get you to give them the dirt kind of thing. Then that turns into he said, she said. People can say that you said something that maybe you didn't say.
All right. One thing I'd say is be careful. Don't say anything you wouldn't want that you shouldn't say in those. But you are right. Stick around, have that conversation, and make yourself available. But just remember that you really, even if it's your best friend in the building, you really can't divulge too much information. All right, moving on. The last part about constructive discipline has to do with PBIS. And I know every single one of you here is very, very familiar and probably much more familiar than I am with PBIS. But PBIS is a big, how big is it in South Carolina? Anybody?
The past few schools that I've worked at, we've used PBIS, so it's something that most principals are interested in or are doing right now.
Our district adopted it 3 years ago.
Anyone else? South Carolina? How?
Every school that I worked in, we did it.
Okay. All right. So you're very well familiar with what PBIS and the concepts behind it, and that it's a three-tier system. So I don't have to spend too much time talking about it, but it is a part of that constructive discipline that we are talking about tonight. There's a primary prevention, secondary prevention, and the final prevention, which is the high individualized perception. There is a bell curve that people are supposed to fall within two, or a certain number within each one of these. I do know that in every district that I've been in, we've had PBIS, and I know that routinely there are concerns that come from staff about the immense amount of work that's required for level 2 in particular, as well as MTSS level 2. So PBIS, I don't need to tell any of this. You know how it works. You know, PBIS is certainly becoming a national phenomenon. And if districts haven't adopted it, I think it's certainly on the radar for others. And it started out as to get less and less kids into special education and to have more services, mainstream services. So, all right. My throat is killing me. So, do you guys want to add anything, or are we ready to call it a night? Anybody want to add anything about constructive discipline? Want to ask any questions about where you should be in your projects or anything like that?
I guess I could add that my school is a community school, and one of the things that we're trying to implement is restorative justice kind of thing. And so we're also working to think about how we can implement that to put more responsibility on the students and have the students be responsible for determining the discipline kind of actions. And so, yeah, the restorative justice idea is like, you know, you repair the harm that's caused by the actions kind of thing. And so I think that's an interesting approach to discipline.
All right. Anyone else has a different kinds of discipline approach in your district? All right. Any questions on any of your assignments or anything like that? All right. Then I'm done. We will see you next week, and I'll stick around if anybody has any specific questions. But if not, have a great week. Stay dry. Take care, and a great weekend too.